Welcome everyone to Think Data Thursday. So today we're delighted to welcome Bridget Cogley to our webinar titled The Logic of Dashboards, Designing for the Whole Picture. So Bridget has a wealth of experience with Tableau going back as far as version 6.0, I think. She's a two-time Zen Master and is passionate about meaningful design and ethics in BI. Bridget is a senior consultant at Technion and is based out of Columbus, Ohio. So it's an area famous for its ice creams, I'm told. So you can check out more about Bridget at tablewfit.com, or you can follow her on Twitter at winscogley. So we should have time at the end of the webinar today for some Q&A. So during the session, if you can just pop your questions into that Q&A module, and at the end of the session, we should have time for Bridget to answer any questions that you have. So take it away, Bridget.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. And I will go ahead and stop my video now, but I do want to just do a quick introduction, so thank you for that introduction. One of the other things about me is my previous background as an American Sign Language interpreter, so that really informs a lot of how I approach this work. The other piece is I did come from more of a business side, so I've done everything from HR, management, training, prior to moving into this work as an analyst. So I did a lot more in the soft space and more in the business space. And ultimately my core focus these days is dashboard design. So figuring out how it is we build a better dashboard. And so without further ado, I kind of want to go into a process that we may be familiar with, which is where we start with a chart and we kind of look at, okay, here we've got this chart. And I'll leave discussions about this chart and, you know, are there good things to do with dual access to Steve Wexler's TDT? That was a couple weeks ago. But one thing I may notice in my exploration is, hey, what's going on with profit? Profit seems to be a little bit low. Oh, actually, sorry about that. I do want to do a couple housekeeping things. So the goals of this webinar are really to start building better dashboards. And so I'm hoping that you've come here with the hope to build dashboards that require less explaining, less revisions and back and forth, and less kind of those small little tweaks that we end up doing. Some of the other goals I'm hoping that you get out of this are that you improve usage and have better adoption. So that's how I define a better dashboard. One other piece, I'm going to keep hitting these big ideas, and so I'll go over these in a bit more detail. So one of them is the idea of setting the tone. Another is going from large to small. A third is the single question. And I feel like we've probably heard this a few times before, but I'll go over this again. And the last is beyond the chart. And this is one I'll really kind of hammer home towards the end. So going back into our exploration, this is kind of what this process has looked like for me historically, where you kind of start with some charts. You go, okay, well, this is interesting. Tell me more about this. So maybe I've taken profit and done it by category, and okay, well, this is interesting. What happens if I aggregate and compare to figure out, is the mix a little bit different? What's going on? And so then maybe I'm looking at trend of sales, and I may notice things like, okay, what's going on in March? Why is the 17th of November a really hot day? And then, okay, well, everybody loves a map, so I'll go ahead and put that in there. And then I'm going to start this kind of building of the dashboard. And I feel like this is a process where we've been trained, you know, maybe we double click, maybe we drag certain things out. Maybe we put different things in different spots. Maybe we put the map somewhere. And we end up with a dashboard that's kind of something like this. Maybe we'll tweak it, maybe we'll rearrange things. But we'll spend a lot of time kind of trying to figure out how we want things arranged and looking at this analysis and moving things around. Maybe we also look at this and say, hey, I need some KPIs. My boss is going to want this. And so then we kind of throw these KPIs out here and voila, you know, and I know my very first dashboard probably looked a bit like this, scroll bars and all. So this is oftentimes kind of our beginning kind of process. We start building dashboards where we've made these charts, we've done this exploration, maybe we spend a bit of time kind of adjusting things to make them work out. But then we really start kind of moving from there of, okay, well, I've done this, maybe I'm going to tidy it up a bit when I start learning about containers. And then, hey, I've learned to float legends. So then I'm going to start floating the legends. And maybe one of the other parts I want to start doing is making this look nicer. And so this is kind of a loop where we go through, we make the colors nicer, maybe we color code our dual axis a bit, we try to find nicer colors, and sometimes we push things back on the map. And I don't know about you, but this is a process that I went through. This was my exact path. I made very scary critters to, hey, I made slightly better critters. But what I wanted to understand was, how do I make a better dashboard? I got to this point, but then what? And so a big part of this journey was a few years ago. I went through this big discovery phase of, how do I build a better dashboard? Who does dashboarding well? What are dashboards really? And I came up with this idea of a language, and that maybe there's something to this. And so I've got this big, long theory, but today I'm not going to discuss that. What I'm going to focus on today is something a little bit more close to home, something that you can kind of put to action right away. So I will say, this talk is out there, this journey is out there. I did it for TC16, I've got it all over my blog. So if you want to learn more about the journey and how I came up with these ideas and these kind of 4 rules I'm going to discuss today, it's out there. And so I'm going to change lanes pretty drastically and put this to practice for a second. And so this will have importance later. It's one of these kind of diversions I'm taking you on, but I promise you it has value. And what I'm going to do is a quick exercise, so if you will humor me, and just take a minute and describe the room that I'm going to put on. Think about, you can either do this verbally, if you've got a sticky note, write down a couple words, but I'm only going to give you about a minute or 2, and I want you to describe this room as if I wasn't there. I'm going to give you a couple more seconds to think on it, maybe jot a couple more notes down. And then I'm going to jump to one question. And my question to you is, where did you start? And when I do this presentation live, I find people start kind of a wide variety of places. I historically have found 50% of people go to the table, maybe 35% go to the window. Another 10% will start with the lights. Again, I'm looking at starting, not 2 or 3 layers down, but starting. And then every now and then I get somebody that starts off with the painting or somewhere else. And I've done this a lot with a number of different pictures and groups. And I find one thing to be fairly common, and I'm hoping a couple of you will tell me I'm wrong, but what I find is very few people start off with the words conference room. And I do find that this has a linguistic bias. When I do this test with native signers or speakers of other languages, sometimes I find that languages actually come back with different answers. So there is a language bias. So if you are a native English speaker, I expect you to hit the table or room first. If you speak other languages as your primary language, just know that there is a linguistic bias to this. So I did find this to be an interesting experiment, and this has use later on. So I didn't just take you down this path for no good reason. I promise you it has a reason, because it goes back to these big ideas where we think about setting the tone, and telling me that this is a conference room is a way to set the tone. From there, we go large to small. So sometimes people start with the window, they start with the table. These are the 2 biggest things. Then they work their way to the light. Then they work their way to the painting. And so we're already doing this idea of large to small. And ultimately, the question you're trying to answer for me is, what is this room? And this room is not a table. This room is not chairs. This room is a whole composition. And so that's what I mean when I talk about moving beyond the chart. So this is kind of an exercise I use as a test. It really gets people thinking about moving dashboards in that way. So without further ado, I'm going to break this down into the 4 parts. So the first is when we look at setting the tone. And when we look at setting the tone, some of this is the look, the feel, and the flow, but it's also providing the context. And so a part of this is I am going to revisit that dashboard. And the first thing you're going to notice I'm going to do is, instead of hitting tiled, I am going to hit floating. I'm also going to delete my reminder. This is there for me. And I'm going to come and I'm going to do a live build. And part of this is me thinking of, how do I want to put these things out there? And looking at, when I build this composition and think about how my end users are going to use this, I am setting a tone. I am trying to make a composition for others that they can understand immediately. And so you'll kind of see me kind of play around with sizing a little bit, but then I'm going to throw on these other pieces and parts. And I do think that the difference of floating and tiled, I think it matters. I think it affects how you analyze the data. I know for me, when I've got things moving around, it's very hard to see. And so I'm going to start here. I'm going to kind of maybe put this guy up here on the top because I feel like that's a good spot. These KPIs, I did intentionally make them light because I'm going to put them up here. And I feel like this starts to give my work a bit more of a branded feel. It feels a little bit maybe like the corporation I work for. And so I'll kind of move these guys up here. I'll fuss with them a little bit more later. But part of this is looking at the analysis and beginning to understand what is it I want to convey to my end users? What is it I want them to do? And so you'll kind of see I move these pieces around and I just think about what am I trying to convey? And so maybe the legend goes away. I'm going to pull this piece out that's hidden, and then maybe I'm going to realize, oh, hey, I need one more piece because something seems a mess. And so you'll see I'll kind of pull this other legend out. So rather than having a legend, I'm going to use a chart as a legend today. And so I'll pull this piece out there. I'll keep doing a little bit more work on this and moving things around and kind of figuring out how do I want this to flow? How do I want my users to interact with this? We are going to do a little bit of kitchen magic here in that I'm going to go ahead and hop over to the final version of this, to where you can see ultimately where I've ended up. And so you'll notice a few things in setting the tone. I've added some chart art, if you will. I've put in lines that really weren't there. I've helped organize my KPI. So this just sets the tone here. I've really pushed these colors back. One of the things that most people don't notice, but that's very important to me because it does start to reinforce these relationships, is I've got this blue for sales. So wherever I've used the sales metric, that item is blue. And then with profit, I've got this teal. And so I've kept things in kind of this teal and green family when it relates to profit. And then lastly, I've got quantity, which is just totally different. And I've went ahead and made it its own separate color. Just by setting the tone and playing with color very strategically, I help people navigate this without them even realizing it. I've also added in some icons to help cue people where to click. One of the other new features I've done is I went ahead and said, hey, here's this lasso to select. So instead of having a drop-down filter to pick a period of time, what people can do instead is kind of take some practices from D3, select this, you'll notice the entire dashboard changes, and that's done through a set action. And so then that way you can actually see this last year. And then in the final version of this, I did take some time and put in some coding in the tooltips to help people understand what's filtered and what's not. So just by providing cues, pushing the color back, and really focusing on the image I want to project, I've really changed how this dashboard is understood. So the next point I want to hit is this idea of large to small. And any English majors know exactly what I'm talking about, where you're building a main idea, and then you're putting in supporting items, and then you get into the detail. I also call this approach faceting. And so I'll kind of get into what I mean by that. This is an example of an exploration I've done. And part of this is to support the idea of where do I want to work today? And so in looking at where do I want to work today, I can see that my master bedroom has a lot of change and it's fairly volatile from a temperature standpoint. This is real data, by the way. So if you look through here and you go, man, your house is cold. Yes, yes, it is. But part of what I'm trying to understand is where do I want to work? And so this is a great exploration for me as the analyst. It's not a good exploration to answer the question I have, which is where should I work? And what I've done in this dashboard, I've started very large to small. So my high level idea is what room is most comfortable. And so by starting out, I understand my master bedroom is actually quite comfortable. When I get to where I should be working, which is my office, I find it's not nearly as comfortable. Just that kind of 5-degree Fahrenheit makes a difference. And what I can see is when I click on my master bedroom, I can kind of see how volatile it is per day. As I scan over, I can actually filter by day to really get an exact feel for what that day is doing. So this also helps support how I build actions. Versus, let's say I look at my office. You can see over time, it's getting colder. You can also see that evening, not overnight, seems to be the bigger problem. And so I can kind of look at that. I can see that there's a lot more variation in that. Some of that comes from when we put the sensors down there. But I can also see that I've outlined my comfort zone. So I did use this idea of that chart. And I also made it so I could hover and kind of work with these bits and pieces. So you see that this faceting logic really supports this drill down to the detail. So moving on to trying to answer a single question, and I feel like sometimes when we're designing these dashboards, we get hit with this idea of we must answer everything for everybody. And I really tend to push against that. I really push for having a single question, trying to do these kind of short answers, then expanding, and then kind of doing sometimes what certain people call like the 5 whys or kind of the what next. And my goal in doing this is clarity. And so I did this exercise for mobile, and this is extraordinarily stripped down. I show this sometimes and people tell me, oh, I could never put something this minimal in production. This is a great way to start. And so one of the things when I'm designing is I start either in gray or in a single color to really focus laser sharp, with laser sharp precision on what it is I'm trying to answer. And so my question with this is simply, how is shipping doing? What should I know about shipping? And so part of when I look at shipping, I'm looking at how many items did I send out? What product count did that represent? How am I, how quickly are these things shipping out? And then am I discounting potentially because of shipping? And then again, starting kind of that high to low and answering the single question, I'm looking at where is my standard transit time falling? The other part is, okay, well, does it differ from same day, first class, second class, third class? And then lastly, getting into more of the nitty-gritty details of each individual item. So just figuring out, do certain items get sent a certain way? One of the things I've also put on this that's not shown just yet, but will be in a second, is I put set actions. So what I wanted this to be was a more comparative dashboard. And part of the reason it's designed the way it is because it's optimized for the mobile. I wanted to get this to be so that if I put this in a warehouse or if I deploy this live, that somebody within a warehouse can use their phone and very quickly explore. This was also a test of the new feature, so I went ahead and I left it on this new automatic layout to just see how could I design knowing that this would automatically convert for me. So this was a test of that as well. So there was some deliberate kind of design choices made just to accommodate that. But what helped me to kind of look at with this analysis, and again, keeping it very minimal, keeping it very simple, was just trying to figure out where things fall. And so in the final version, you'll notice that I actually changed this line from being a very literal transit time to being a difference. I found that what was more effective for me for this analysis was not so much the literal times, but I wanted to see how much variance I had. So we'll see that in a few more moments. But I just wanted to kind of push this idea of thinking about this more from a standpoint of answering a single question, of keeping things pushed back, versus really trying to put everything on there. And so you get a little bit of that. You can kind of add in some features and you can see how you can get this information fairly quickly. You'll also notice that the form factor really limited how much I put on there. And of course, we've got our deep filtering as well. The final piece that I really want to push towards is this idea of moving beyond the chart. And this is where we kind of explore, we build, but then we go back and we do this refine cycle. And this is probably the point I think when I do teaching and when I work with people, I feel like that they struggle with the most. And so some of this is when I start building my explorations and thinking about how do I want to convey things, I'm piecing and parting things into a UI. So I'm setting the tone there for people to understand, okay, this is what I want to convey. And then I'm going to kind of throw things out here of I've got these products, so that's going to be a smaller, more detailed item. And then, maybe I want some trend lines. And so I'll kind of look at this and say, okay, well, I've got this and then maybe I'm kind of curious. Maybe I want to know more about this particular feature. And so maybe I'm putting these category parts in where I want to kind of understand the relationship and figure out, okay, so I've got these items. You'll notice I've kind of cheated a little bit, and there's a reason. And so I'll kind of play with these to get these labeled appropriately and move things around and really look at building an integrated piece. I want people to kind of find this and feel like that it's that they've kind of fallen into a world almost. I'm a big fan of certain photographs. I look at photography a lot. I look at movies a lot for that. Like, do they build a world I'm interested in? Do they build things that I want to see? And so you can kind of see now I'm starting to play with this a little bit. I may even move these pieces on top of each other just to start seeing, can I build something interesting that helps people understand what relates and what doesn't? And so you'll see I'll kind of play with this and I'll finagle with this a fair bit to really make this relationship clear. And so that's a bit of thinking beyond the chart and looking at how do I make interesting things. Seem to be missing a chart, but I'm going to move this guy up here and play around with this. But you see where I'm starting to make interesting things and to support this analysis. And so the final version of this then starts to look more like this, where I really lined these pieces up. And again, this is one big reason why I personally tend to choose to design with floating. I find it makes it easier for me to make these kinds of connections to where if I select California, I can see there's this shift where office supplies really makes up the difference in California. And maybe I want to push that more. Maybe I'm finding my technology isn't selling as much. If I look at a place like Ohio, where I'm from, I can see that Superstore is probably going to move their brick and mortar out of my area, unfortunately. And so that's what this is helping me explore. And from there, I may also start looking at what products need to stay or which ones get to go. But this helps me kind of inform that analysis. I've made some UI and design, and it looks like a cohesive piece. The other thing is, again, I continuously keep pushing back those colors. If I take that same idea to that mobile dashboard and focus a little bit more on user experience and setting the tone and going beyond just the charts, you'll notice I've added, again, more decoration. I've put in little dividers. I've put in just little dots to help people separate, navigate. And so I may play with these and move things around just to get them to look a certain way. And so that way, when I take it to mobile, again, I'm going to kind of take those thoughts, considerations around experiments. I may remove ink. And again, think about the navigation piece. So again, moving beyond the chart, I'm also going to think about the UI a bit and look at, well, if I'm using this on the phone, I don't know about you, I've got some really fat fingers. And so putting safe landing zones for mobile as well is kind of a good consideration too. Thinking about with this particular chart, this is where people are going to click. And so I'm looking at, okay, well, where do I want them to look? Where do I want them to land? And so making it so that they don't have to scroll as much. So these are all kind of different pieces. One of the other experiments that I do with this is, and this one's probably my more extreme example, but really figuring out what could dashboards look like in the future. I don't know about you, but when I watch sci-fi movies, I always wonder, well, why is it black? Why is it, when they design on glass, why is everything in the middle? And I have these questions, and so I seek to answer them through doing dashboards. I seek to say, okay, well, if I've got this HR data set and I want to imagine this HR data set in the future, what could it look like? So this is my little homage to Giorgio Moroder. One of the stories about Giorgio is that he knew he needed to click. So when he was making music and he wanted to design the sound of the 50s and the 60s and kind of push into the future, what could that sound like? He knew he needed something to help create that sound. And so when I designed this dashboard, I knew everything ended up in the middle. And I feel like circles galore happen in all these futuristic dashboards. And so I said, okay, well, if I'm going to do this, I need circles. So you've got a donut chart. but then I needed a way to help people navigate. So it's like, okay. And so I just put in various data artifacts. So these little lines mean nothing other than to anchor you over to this timeline. You'll notice that, I've got turnover, the labels are in weird spots. Again, when I look at these futuristic dashboards, when I look at sci-fi movies, I feel like they look at this, and I really wanted to understand why. I went ahead and just kind of altered some of these bar charts, and then I kind of just did some survey responses. So how do people feel about their work-life balance? How do people feel about job satisfaction? And I've got those color-coded based on the turnover, so that you can kind of see people who turn over tend to be less satisfied, tend to be less happy with their work-life balance, and aren't happy with the environment. I wanted to see, does travel affect this? So if I'm looking at people who travel rarely versus travel frequently. And then non-travel, surprisingly, was the winner on least satisfaction. So maybe people need a little bit of travel. I wanted to play again with set actions and just look at, as I start, looking at degrees, do certain people make up a major part of our composition? And so kind of building this out and playing with this, it's a very odd shape, and the lines are there solely to reinforce the relationship. Again, this is playing with data art a bit, playing with abstraction, because if you look at a lot of these futuristic dashboards, there is this abstraction. And then I went ahead and made a manual donut chart. So this is hacking with math, a lot of circle calculations, and just trying to make it so that I didn't have two donut charts overlapping in the same spot. I really wanted it in a weird spot. You'll notice there's a ton of color in this. And so again, when I looked at futuristic dashboards, I looked at works like Tron, I looked at the colors that they use. And so this yellow is really an ugly color on white. So you can actually see it on the tooltips. It's a terrible, terrible color when you put it on white. But it looks awesome on a black background. I've got a lot of noise with these white lines, and that helps just kind of line things up, but puts a sense of balance and just makes it look a certain way. I've got a lot of translucency. The population pyramid is really, really thin. It's got a lot of color. I've got these bar charts behind it to help reinforce the relationship. I have a lot more male employees than female employees. Because I had that gap there, I was able to extend this chart in that space. So it's not a very boxed in dashboard. Now people say, well, I could never get away with this at work. And I agree, I could never get away with this at work either. And so I decided to make a normal-ish version. And again, this takes into mind some of those practices of what are my big questions. So when I look at this and kind of figure out what am I trying to answer, when we deal with HR data, I feel like the first thing I end up having to answer is, what's my attrition? What's going on with my employees? Are they staying or are they going? So I've got a 16% attrition rate. I can kind of see the ones who quit called out with the brighter color. I'm looking at traveling frequently. Again, this is another area where I went ahead and just put in a set action. So I mean, it's still very modern. It's still something that's probably a little too edgy to get away with in the work environment. But it was something that I did as an experiment. And so you can see, again, just by using set actions and playing with subtlety, being able to call out these particular things without it being too noisy. Again, pushing for more abstraction, looking at things like degrees, and again, doing kind of this composition and encouraging people to click and play. This is another way to kind of draw people into our dashboards and get them thinking perhaps a little bit differently than they have historically, while really making a nice, gentle balance on just color and what we're trying to convey. And again, you can see my population pyramid is here. You can see I knocked it down. It takes up less space. And then again, that I'm no longer moving into its space. The final piece that I did with this puzzle was, okay, well, I know why futuristic dashboards are black now, because when I did this, what I call corporate redact, which is, okay, you know, most corporations I know, they prefer lighter colors, and they push you to, you know, use certain color guides. And so I went ahead and kind of put this same type of futuristic dashboard on white. And I feel like it lost some of the magic when I did this. So everything's the same except for a couple of pieces. So I had to push this red to orange. It just felt way too harsh and overbearing. on the lighter dashboard. So you can see just with this corporation redact, I had to make noticeable changes. Again, I left this yellow as is. I probably should change this. But there's something lost. And then you'll notice too that I knocked out the color on this. It started to get too noisy with all the colors on that kind of futuristic style. So I left these guys separate in part so I could kind of go ahead and do this and let you see these guys side by side to compare as well. It was an interesting story to me. It was really fascinating to see these two side by side together to understand what the future and to understand when I set the tone, when I put things on black, when I play with color and I make these very branded looking items, how color matters and how the background makes a difference. Just the chart choices and how I place things. Again, this is one big reason that I personally tend to go with floating over tiled pretty much any day of the week because it does give me that control. So I really wanted to kind of put these out there and let you see the differences in just the design and the thought process. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up and start moving towards questions. So again, I want to reinforce these big ideas of the idea of setting the tone of how is it that we think about when we walk into a room, how do we tell people what this room is? And, you know, same thing with a dashboard. As soon as people see it, they make a 2-second evaluation. And I want that evaluation to be as successful as it can be. When I'm designing, I'm not necessarily making the pieces larger, but what I'm doing is I'm trying to go from a high-level idea. So whether I'm thinking about employee retention with HR data, or I'm thinking about, you know, setting the tone with retail data and saying, okay, well, here are my sales and my profit. And now I'm going to start giving you details into this analysis. I focus my work with a single question, and sometimes I will very literally even type that question up there, especially if I'm struggling. And so sometimes I take that single question to a whiteboard and I'm taking it out with sticky notes and figuring out what are they asking? What is it that they want to know so that they can then take this to action? I really care a lot about moving towards momentum. And then the final piece is not just designing these individual charts and pieces. And again, this is probably why I push the hardest against tiles and against a lot of data ink that separates my charts. I want people to see this as an integrated piece. So that way, when I'm looking at things like a conference room, I'm not just seeing a window or a table, but I'm seeing a whole room. And ideally, that room is inviting. It's one of the reasons why I love to go to open houses, because I like to see how people draw me in. I like to see what tricks they're using. Are they using color? Are they using different little tiny features? So a lot of times I put in lines, or I group certain things together to tell people these pieces are meaningful together. So it's not just putting in charts on a dashboard, but it's also looking at this as a whole. And so these are really the big ideas I would love to leave you with. And what I find is that they all flow together. As soon as I set the tone, that really helps me move beyond the chart. When I start working large to small, usually I'm doing so in the pursuit of a single question. So you'll see that these guys really do fold into each other and almost become one at the end. So that's me. And now I will go ahead and move to questions, because I'm sure you've got bunches.
We sure do. Thanks, Bridget. So Kira here. So we have about 6 questions in the Q&A module, but I just had a quick question myself, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
So Bridget, you have a really strong background in American Sign Language and interpretation. And I was just curious, how do you feel that that's helped you in creating dashboards that are really easy to understand, get that message across to the receiver?
So interpreting is an exercise in understanding what people are saying. So there is a process proposed by Betty Kalanimis, where you're taking the message. It's a very deliberate, active listening. So I'm listening. I'm trying to understand what you're saying, what the mood is. I'm looking at the entire context and the entire picture of what's happening. And I'm seeing what you're saying, and then I'm articulating it as if I were you. And I take that kind of same idea of, if you had my skills to do this analysis, what would you make? What would you want to see? And so I do see myself really taking my interpreter role to this same practice of, okay, I'm interpreting from here's the raw data. I know you want to find this in the raw data, or you want this answered. How do I bridge that gap? How do I make it easier for you to understand? And I own that. A lot of times when you're interpreting, I'm taking what people are saying. I'm trying to make sure that, okay, if you are having a bad day, I want this other person to know that. I want this other person to get that same sense. I want to be as invisible to this process as possible. And so I'm also monitoring myself the entire time, where I'm saying, okay, well, you're having a bad day. Am I just projecting that because I rushed here, I spilled the Starbucks latte on my lap, and I had to do this rushed clean job in the bathroom, and and I'm like this. So am I projecting that on you, or is it legit that you also had a bad day? Maybe you also spilled coffee on your lap, or you got here harried and this person is asking too many questions. So I'm trying to take these ideas and really push myself out and understand what are my client or my stakeholders' needs so that I can make this as clear as possible to them.
Great, thanks, Bridget. So we'll move over to the Q&A module now. So first up, whenever you get a data set, what is the first thing you do? I want to understand the process of making dashboards from crash.
So a big thing that I do is I do these explorations. And so it's not that exciting to watch because I make a lot of these charts where it's like, okay, I make scatter plots. And so I'll sit here and you'll notice I'm working in gray and I'm trying to not make complex charts. So I really try to say, okay, well, what's going on here? Maybe I want to see this by time of day and I'm going to make this a line chart and I'm going to pull some of this stuff off. And I just want to see what's going on. And so I do these really quick crash explorations to see what is happening. And so I'll spend a lot of time making dozens and dozens and dozens of charts. It's a process I try not to let people see because usually when they do, they stare at me. But I spend a lot of time making lines, bars, and scatter plots. And from there, then I go to this, okay, well, now I want to start looking at how do I begin building this? How do these pieces work together? So that's a big part of why I start with floating. It's a big part of where you see that sloppy, I literally click 3 or 4 of these and say, do these items relate to each other? So, I come here and I say, okay, well, does this have any relation to this? So, I may sometimes very literally put these pieces together where it's like, I know these items relate. And I may put them here and play around. Well, this map is going to end up being a big deal. And so I may even dedicate more space to it and move it around. There's a lot of this finagling and moving. And then I'll start kind of piecing and parting and adding color. Color is usually fairly late in the workflow. If I can, I really try to encourage people to drop out as much color as possible. And I'll also call out with that idea, I'm not alone. There are other people who say that you should start focusing not so much on color right away. Use color very sparingly. Sometimes people call that boring, but what I find is it really helps you channel and focus to putting the color in where it matters. So, and then once I get this done, then I start adding junk sometimes, if you will. I start putting in these lines. I start putting in the titles a certain way, or I realize, okay, I've expanded my map so large that I do have to use a text box so that it's nicely labeled. I'll also go through and check. Some of this process is informed by years of dysfunction. So I started using Tableau in version 6. So some of the newer features, it's like, oh yeah, you can do this workbook level formatting. And so I realized way too late that it's available. But the big thing is I do this long exploration and I put these pieces and parts together. When I work with clients, the other thing I do is I really try to understand their questions. And so a lot of my work ends up being maybe a set of 2 or 3 dashboards. So oftentimes I'll go, okay, what are you trying to achieve? And I'll break out those questions. I do have a whiteboard, big fan of the whiteboard. But I'll break these guys out into, okay, well, we're looking at this more regional side. You can see Tableau punked me a little bit with some updates, so I've got to go through and clean up my filters. But then I'll break it out by state, and then I'll look at, okay, here's your special question. This is another way to get around that. We want this to do everything. And I really, really buck against the idea that this should be all things to all people. The more targeted and focused you are, the more successful you are. The lack of clarity, lack of results is kind of what I say. So when you don't have that clarity, I find I struggle, and I find others do as well.
Sounds good. So speaking about the whiteboard, our next question is, do you ever sketch out your dashboard first?
So I very rarely go in with a predefined notion. A lot of it builds in with this exploration. The more I restrict myself at the beginning, the more I find I struggle. Again, I'm one of these people. I do best with very loose and open frameworks. I love a blank canvas. When I go in too organized and too planned, I have a hard time with that, because then I have this locked in notion, and sometimes I'm fighting with the data. Because I typically, when I get in and I do my exploration, I find things. I find things that I think they should know about as well. And so that's part of what I try to bring to these is, oh, hey, I found this, and I think you should take a look at this. I have found things that have made people angry because they go, well, that's not what we wanted to know. It's like, okay, well, this is what your data is telling me. But I don't usually sketch out. I use Tableau to sketch.
Sounds good. Next up, should the dashboard be just for telling the story, or does it need to be more visually appealing?
So I feel like those things are connected. It's very much like when I walk into a house. If a house doesn't have a lot of decorations, or if it's not a home, I know, and it makes it less inviting. I kind of like, so when you walk into an apartment and you're trying to figure out, do I want to live here? It's a big reason why I go to open homes, like open houses, because you can see the homes where people just want to sell it, and they get a lot lower selling price because they haven't dressed it up a bit, because they haven't invoked that imagination. And so I do find that if I invite users in, because I do find that when you show somebody a dashboard, there's that 2-second, I make my first kind of impression and decision about this dashboard. And the more cosmetically appealing I make it, the more likely people are to use it and not complain. And I kind of go back to my initial efforts where, you know, I made some of these dashboards, and you've got this idea of pretty, this is not functional. This is still garish. This is not, you know, the colors are nice. It's everything the textbook tells you to do, but it's not inviting. It's not something that I want to sit and spend my time using, because it's hostile. And I do have a post. I've not posted it yet, but I've got something where it's basically, don't use this dashboard. And so I do think we cue our users with making things a little bit more inviting, a little bit more open of, what is this?
Okay, next question. Would love to see the dashboards when available. Do you have any courses you recommend for data viz?
Great question. Courses, again, I'm kind of a self-learner, so I tend to hit blogs, if anything else. Two of the big blog posts I would recommend is McCann. So he's got this really awesome, Adam McCann's got this really awesome kind of post on dashboards and the different types of dashboards. And so you've got things like where he talks about the KPI dashboard. And I find I do these rarely. I do them sometimes, but these are usually the things people put on a big screen. What I find, I live in the space of these Q&A dashboards. I live in the space of some of these top-down and bottom-up dashboards. I try to avoid these one-chart dashboards because, again, like he mentions, it requires a high level of literacy. And so I don't like those just because they tend to be your more complex chart types. So typically within business, I'm living within these kind of first three. The other part out there that I'd recommend, and this is going back a ways, but this is probably one of the epitome posts. I mean, I would print this and put this right next to your computer, but it's just about Kelly's approach to dashboard, and the fact that this is a quote I know I've run around a lot with, is beauty is meaningful design. And so you look at the BlackBerry versus the iPhone and how transformative it was, and that's because beauty is meaningful design, because you think about the entire process, you think about what you're putting out there. And so I really like this post for that as well. I know Tableau offers courses. For me, the biggest accelerant to my learning was getting out there, was actually doing the work, and it was hard. It was extraordinarily difficult, but a part of what I did was I forced myself to come up with theories and defend them. And I found, for me, again, as probably more oriented to self-learning than most people, I found this to be the most helpful. So I mean, I went from playing with charts and doing very simple things to getting this really big defense of what makes a good dashboard and how do I do better. So I think there's a point, particularly with this, you almost have to defend it to yourself. And I think when you do that, that really teaches you what your dashboards could be and why. And then the final piece is, yes, these resources are out there. So once we're done with the presentation, I'll go through and make these items available for download so that, yes, you can definitely pull these items down. You can see this one's already here. I'm going to click the button now. So I know a flurry of people are going to run off. But nonetheless, these items are out there. And I intentionally build these in Tableau so that I can share them.
Great, thanks, Bridget. So a question then from Brian Smith. What is your favorite way to add lines to a dashboard?
There's a couple different ways, and it depends on the type of line I'm making. And I've shown this workflow to Tableau a few times because I have my long rant on what I would like for this experience to be versus what it is today. And so one key common way of doing that is you simply take a text box. And so we come to here, we take this cute little text box, and I'm not going to add any text at all, and I'm going to come to layout, and I'm going to put a color on it, and today it doesn't matter what color it's going to be, and then yes, you're going to see it, it's going to happen. I'm going to drag this out, and then because Tableau loves me, they gave me where I can use keyboard shortcuts now and start moving these things around, and then I'm going to knock it down to 1. That works for a solid line, but then the other thing I will do, and you'll notice I've done on a few different dashboards, is I'm going to take and I'm going to put this text box out here, and I'm going to literally hit the period key multiple times. And so sometimes I do that, and then because I am a little nutty, I will sit there and worry about which font the period is, because some periods in certain fonts are really nice and circular, and others are not. Again, this is that either attention to detail, obsession with detail, pick your poison, and then I'll move that around. And so again, you can use your keyboard keys to move these things around. You do have to select it within the dashboard to move them around, but then I'll kind of play with that. I will also rotate these things. So I will go into text box objects and rotate them and move them this way. So if I want that line to go that way. So great question. Thank you for asking that.
So next question. So it sounds like you're pushing for floating tiles. I wonder how the phone layout works when the dashboard was built in float. Can you go back to that dashboard and maybe show us again?
So this goes back to some experiments, and I'm actually going to pull up the full experiment dashboard because, again, I'm glad you asked that question. So this is where my initial analysis, and so you can see this is full floating. I did, for sake of alignment and stuff, use containers, and you can see where I was kind of testing what can this thing do. And so then I put it to phone, and this is not a good look for a dashboard. So you can see where sometimes when you do floating, you get these very suboptimal experiences. So this is where I did that stripped down version. And again, all my work is floating. So you can see that it converts it to tiles. I do want to call that out, is that it will automatically convert this off to a tiled layout. So that's something else to keep in mind. So when you go full floating, the phone layout then becomes full tiled. And so the final part that I did, so this is the do-it-yourself mobile. And this is where I went into the phone layout. It was on automatic. And what I did, they gave me this awesome clear all button. And I hit it because, you know, I looked at the original version of this and went, oh, this ain't great. It also extended it out far past what I wanted it to be. And I said, you know what? Start over. And that's what I did. And then I redragged everything else out to get it how I wanted it and to make sure that I had this floating and that I had the pieces exactly how I wanted them. So I wanted this text box here and I wanted these items on it. So great question. So sometimes mobile works out really well. Sometimes I do spend a lot of time editing this. The other part with mobile that I typically tend to do is I try to put some type of a color background, especially for users of iPhone. I find that white is alarmingly bright. And so I do try to knock down the background a smidge.
Good
And
tips.
I'll do that even with just taking a whole bit of text and dragging that down behind. I can definitely go in dashboard and change it, but then what I find is you end up kind of with this fight between these two items.
Next up, how do you decide which chart to pick and which color to choose?
So again, going back to kind of say this initial analysis, I usually start with a desktop layout, and then I usually start with things knocked out. So I do a lot of kind of finagling, looking, does this make sense? And then sometimes I'll go back and edit a chart. Sometimes I'll make an entirely new chart because, you know, I'm seeing that I like the analysis, but maybe I don't like how the chart's telling the story. So then I'll go in and edit the chart or change the chart or go with a whole new chart. You know, or I start down a path and I go, okay, this is interesting, but I'm going to do it this way, or I'm going to add this. So for example, with this, you know, maybe this really doesn't make sense long term, and I take this out and change it to something else. But I'll kind of finagle with these and look around, and there's definitely a lot of back and forth and kind of agility within this process. The other thing I do is once I think I get it to a point that I like, I step away. I really try not to sit there and finagle with it too much. I try to take a few moments away from it. So where I'm not looking at this and I come back with fresh eyes and then reevaluate it.
Quick comment from Joe Upheld that you're the Bob Ross of Tableau dashboards.
I thought that
you'd
was
like that, Bridget.
I thought that was Joshua Milligan. I don't know that I qualify for a Bob Ross. Thank you though.
So next question. I like the random lines to help with the design. How are you adding those lines to make them zigzag around the sheet placement on the dashboard, i.e. on your Marauder page?
Marauder is where it gets really, really fascinating. Those are actually charts. And so I'll go ahead and pull this up. And again, Marauder was a bit of an experiment because I wanted it to look a certain way. And so you'll also notice I label things a certain way. So that way I can kind of keep track of what things are. And so where do they fall? And so all this is I did a lot of rounding and indexing and playing with the data to find a way to make the line. So this is definitely hacking and playing with your data. This goes so far in the realm of data art. I don't even think it's funny. But yes, I have actually made lines. And so this made a really good line. And so I reused it multiple times. And then with this other line, so that's the blue line, this was another, okay, I need this with this index, and I took business travel for that one. So it was finding the right data to make the right line. Definitely not best practice, but just something to think about. I have also gone into PowerPoint and made shapes. So me and the PowerPoint get along fine. I will go in there and make various graphics and pull them in. So sometimes I've wanted title bars where they've gone across and then had a weird shape down. I'll often go to a corporate website when I'm working with a client and steal as many assets from them as I can. So how are they making this website? What things can I bring in to help facilitate communication, ease of learning, because they already know it from their website? How can I pull that in and make it useful for them? And then the final piece of this, again, is you see where, because I'm floating, I can nudge things around. So I can sit here and literally make sure that this lines up exactly where I want it to. And so that way, it's in the right spot, it's behind, so there's a little bit of fudge room on that chart. And then this particular chart, again, is really getting friendly with window calculations. So just being able to make this, it's just circles going around to make that full kind of circle chart. And then I wanted it to start at a specific spot, so I did kind of play with index a bit, and I played with where these things fell.
Thanks, Bridget. So another question from Carol Garcia. Can you speak more about your initial paid work using Tableau and how you got your foot in the door?
So when I first started using Tableau, I was working at a company and I was managing a marketing managing a marketing department. I was supporting sales through RFP work, doing a bit of grant writing, and then we just happened to get Tableau because we were doing all of our reporting on Excel. This was we were actually looking initially at version 5.3. They said, no, wait, 6 is coming. You will love 6. Part of our evaluation process was that we needed something that could do mobile. And I know when people hear that, you know, version 6 and mobile, that's because we're going into Adobe Muse, embedding it, and then doing all sorts of hacks to make it scale and to do the things we wanted it to do. Again, so I do come from a little bit of an older school. I joke that I started using Tableau before my area had a user group. And it's true. It took about 1.5 years before user group showed up in my area. And I was one of the more experienced people. And I was still making things at that time that looked a lot like that. And maybe on a good day, this. But I was hoping I'd find people who knew more than I did. So I got plugged in with Michael Cristiani, and he mentored me and taught me a lot about Tableau, but then he also encouraged me to get involved in the community. And so it was through the community and through Michael Cristiani that I moved from kind of this ad hoc role where Tableau maybe made 5 to at most 15% of my job to where I actually got paid to do Tableau full time. It still blows my mind. It's the easiest job I've ever had. I can safely design a dashboard and nobody's going to spit at me or throw things at me, which happens with interpreting sometimes. And I don't have to work crazy hours of the day, which also happens with interpreting and also startups. So it's probably the nicest, easiest job I've ever had. And I learned a lot through consulting, including knowing what I did and didn't know, because you get thrown all sorts of crazy things while you're a consultant. And it's a lot of fun. But I would say if you're looking to make a move, get involved in the community. That is the forums, that is Twitter, that can be LinkedIn. I don't know that I've seen as much of a community on LinkedIn. Also the user groups, getting plugged in that way as well. And then starting to, if you're looking locally, get to know your local areas. So that's where the user group comes into play. If you're looking, you know, all over, then I would say definitely starting out with the Tableau community. Twitter is a fantastic resource for that. And that's where I'm, most active. And getting to know people and having those conversations. The other big part is if you are looking at moving into Tableau consulting, I know a lot of people are going out here on Tableau Public and they're looking. There are people who are pulling in stats. There are people who are participating in things like Makeover Monday and Workout Wednesday and Project Health Viz. And so when you get on Twitter, you find all these activities. It's a great way to make a name for yourself and to put yourself out there and to be seen and heard.
Great, thanks, Bridget. So we're at the top of the hour now. We do have some additional questions, so perhaps we can follow up afterwards. And I know that the session is recorded. It'll be available on our YouTube channel shortly. And I'd like to thank everyone for coming. And we'll speak to you again at our next Think Data Thursday. Thank you, Bridget.
Thank you.